Blood is supposed to be thicker than water, but in my family, it was just a weapon my sister used to bleed me dry. When she showed up to my wedding in a custom-made white bridal gown and publicly called my groom a pathetic loser, I didn't cry. I smiled, because she had absolutely no idea who she was talking to. If you grew up with a sister like Vanessa, you know what it's like to live your entire life in the shade. I am 26 years old, and for 24 of those years, my sole purpose in the Bennett household was to serve as the unremarkable backdrop that made my older sister shine brighter. My parents, Jason and Brenda, didn't even try to hide their blatant favoritism. Vanessa was the pageant queen, the cheerleader, the one with the blinding smile and the sharp, calculating eyes. I was Chloe, the quiet bookworm who wore hand-me-downs and had a penchant for invisible corners. Whenever I achieved something, Vanessa would immediately orchestrate a crisis or a bigger triumph to pull the spotlight back. When I got accepted into my dream college, Vanessa tearfully announced she had totaled her car and needed my college fund to stay out of debt. My parents gave it to her. When I brought my high school boyfriend, a sweet guy named Caleb, to Thanksgiving dinner, Vanessa spent the entire evening whispering in his ear. 2 weeks later, Caleb dumped me. A month after that, they were officially dating. I learned very early on that if I wanted to keep something or someone safe, I had to hide them from my sister. That was why, when I met Leo, I made a conscious decision to lie to my family. I met Leo at a dingy, off-campus coffee shop where I was working as a barista to pay off my student loans. He was wearing a faded flannel shirt, well-worn work boots, and had a streak of grease on his cheek. He ordered a black coffee, tipped me a $5 bill, and left his favorite sketchbook on the counter. When he came back for it the next day, we started talking. He was funny, grounded, and possessed a quiet confidence that immediately drew me in. He told me he worked in property management. What he didn't tell me until 3 months into our relationship, when we were hopelessly in love, was that his full name was Leonardo Sterling, as in the Sterling family, the family that owned half the luxury real estate in our state. The family whose philanthropic galas were featured in glossy magazines, the ones Vanessa practically drooled over, constantly scheming to score an invite to. Leo had walked away from the family money in his early 20s, wanting to prove he could build something on his own. He was currently managing a portfolio of rundown apartment buildings, driving a 2011 Honda Civic, and living in a modest studio. But he was still the sole heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire. He just absolutely despised the gold diggers and sycophants his wealth attracted. "My family will destroy this," I told him one night, lying on the cheap futon in his apartment. "My sister, if she finds out who you are, she won't stop until she ruins it. She measures a person's worth by their bank account. She's currently dating a cryptocurrency broker just because he leased a Maserati." Leo pulled me close, kissing my forehead. "Then she never finds out. To them, I'm just Leo, the junior property manager. Let them think I'm broke. I don't care about their approval, Chloe. I only care about you." So, the stage was set. When I finally introduced Leo to my family, it went exactly as I had anticipated. My parents hosted a Sunday dinner. Vanessa arrived 30 minutes late, draped on the arm of her flashy new boyfriend, Tyler, wearing a designer dress that screamed, "Look at me." Leo had brought a homemade apple pie and a modest bouquet of daisies for my mother. Tyler brought a bottle of $300 champagne, which he loudly announced the price of before tossing his keys onto the counter. "So, Leo," Vanessa purred across the dining table, swirling the expensive champagne in her glass while eyeing Leo's plain button-down shirt. "Chloe says you manage properties. What does that mean? Are you a landlord? Or do you just plunge toilets when the tenants complain?" My mother, Brenda, chuckled lightly. "Now, Vanessa, play nice." "I do a bit of everything," Leo said mildly, taking a bite of his mashed potatoes. "Whatever keeps the buildings running." Vanessa rolled her eyes, turning to Tyler. "Tyler just closed a 7-figure deal today. He's taking me to Paris next month. You know, Chloe, if you put a little more effort into your appearance, maybe you could find a man who could take you somewhere nicer than the Olive Garden." I felt my blood boil, but under the table, Leo's hand found mine. His thumb rubbed soothingly against my knuckles. He didn't look offended. He looked mildly amused. "I think Chloe is the most beautiful woman in the world," Leo said simply, "and I happen to like the breadsticks." Vanessa scoffed, muttering the word pathetic under her breath. My father, Jason, cleared his throat and quickly changed the subject to golf, completely ignoring the insult hurled at my boyfriend. 2 years later, Leo proposed. We were walking through the local botanical gardens in the pouring rain. He didn't have a photographer hiding in the bushes, and there was no grand, public spectacle. He just dropped to one knee in the mud and pulled out a ring. It wasn't a giant, ostentatious diamond like the ones Vanessa demanded. It was a modest, vintage sapphire surrounded by tiny diamonds. What I knew and what my family didn't was that the ring had belonged to Leo's great-grandmother, a piece of authentic 1920s high jewelry worth more than my parents' entire house. To the untrained eye, it looked like a sweet, budget-friendly antique. When I announced my engagement to my family, the reaction was suffocatingly underwhelming. My mother gave me a stiff hug. My father patted my back. Vanessa grabbed my hand, squinted at the priceless sapphire, and burst out laughing. "Oh, Chloe," she sighed, her voice dripping with faux pity. "It's so you. Small, quaint. Did he get it at a pawn shop?" "It's vintage," I said through gritted teeth. "Right," Vanessa smirked. "Well, I guess when you settle for a maintenance man, you can't expect Tiffany's. Don't worry, sweetie. I'll make sure my bridesmaid's dresses at my future wedding don't outshine your little trinket." I smiled politely, gripping the sapphire tightly. Just wait, I told myself. Just wait. Wedding planning was a nightmare. Traditionally, the bride's parents help with the wedding, but when I approached my parents about a budget, my father sat me down with a heavy sigh. "Chloe, your mother and I are stretched a little thin right now. Vanessa's new skincare business needs capital, and we're her primary investors. We just can't afford to throw a party for you and Leo right now, especially since, well, let's be honest, Leo isn't exactly bringing much to the table." I didn't argue. I didn't beg. Leo and I had already decided we were going to pay for the wedding ourselves. Leo had offered to dip into his trust fund and throw a massive, opulent bash just to rub it in their faces, but I refused. I wanted a beautiful, intimate wedding that reflected us, not a weaponized display of wealth. We booked a charming, rustic barn venue on the outskirts of town. However, my mother had one non-negotiable demand. "Vanessa must be your maid of honor. She's your sister. It would look terrible to the family if you excluded her." Against my better judgment, I agreed. It was the worst mistake of the entire process. Vanessa treated my wedding like a tragic charity case. She complained about the barn venue, calling it unsanitary. She refused to attend the dress fittings unless they were at high-end boutiques, scoffing when I finally chose a beautiful, elegant A-line gown from a local designer. The breaking point of the pre-wedding festivities was the rehearsal dinner. We hosted it at a nice local Italian restaurant. Leo's parents, Arthur and Eleanor Sterling, were in attendance. They were incredibly grounded, lovely people who fully supported Leo's desire to live normally. They had shown up in understated, conservative clothing, blending in perfectly. My parents, of course, completely ignored them, assuming they were just as working class as Leo. Vanessa, fueled by 3 glasses of Merlot, decided it was time to give a toast. She clinked her glass loudly, commanding the room's attention. She stood up, smoothing down a red cocktail dress that was completely inappropriate for a family dinner. "I want to raise a glass to my little sister Chloe," Vanessa began, her voice carrying a theatrical tremor. Growing up, Chloe was always simple. She never asked for much, and she never expected much. And looking around at this quaint little dinner, and looking at Leo, I think it's beautiful that she's finally accepting the life she deserves. The room went dead silent. Arthur Sterling raised an eyebrow, his fork pausing halfway to his mouth. Vanessa pressed a hand to her chest, looking down at me with mocking sympathy. It takes a lot of bravery to just give up on the big dreams and settle. To accept that you're going to live a quiet, unremarkable, paycheck-to-paycheck life. I admire that, Chloe. I really do. You found someone exactly on your level. A guy who fixes sinks and a girl who pours coffee. You're perfect for each other. So, here's to mediocrity. Here's to Chloe and Leo. She raised her glass. My father let out a nervous chuckle. My mother actually raised her glass in agreement. I felt the tears prick my eyes, a lifetime of humiliation threatening to spill over. But then I felt Leo's hand on my thigh. I looked over at him. He wasn't angry. He was looking at Vanessa the way one might look at a cockroach that was about to be stepped on. Across the table, Leo's mother, Eleanor, a woman who routinely had tea with senators, took a delicate sip of her water, a frosty, terrifying smile spreading across her face. "Thank you, Vanessa," I said, my voice eerily calm. That was unforgettable. I thought the rehearsal dinner was rock bottom. I was wrong. Vanessa had saved her masterpiece for the wedding day. The morning of the wedding was chaotic. I was in the bridal suite of the barn venue, getting my hair and makeup done with my two bridesmaids, Sarah and Jessica. Vanessa was nowhere to be found. She hadn't answered her phone all morning. "She's probably hungover," Sarah muttered, pinning a curl to the back of my head. "Just ignore her, Chloe. Today is about you." An hour before the ceremony, the door to the bridal suite banged open. I turned around, and the breath left my lungs. Vanessa stood in the doorway. She was not wearing the dusty rose bridesmaid dress we had selected. She was wearing a wedding dress. It wasn't just a white dress. It was a full-blown, floor-length ivory ball gown encrusted with Swarovski crystals, complete with a sweetheart neckline and a cathedral train. It was louder, more expensive, and significantly more dramatic than my own wedding dress. Her hair was styled in an elaborate updo, woven with baby's breath. "Vanessa," I breathed, genuinely stunned by the sheer audacity. "What are you wearing?" "Oh, this?" Vanessa laughed, doing a small twirl so the crystals caught the light. "I saw it at a boutique last week and I just had to have it. The dusty rose washed me out, Chloe. You know I'm an autumn. Besides, it's not white, it's eggshell. Nobody will even care." "You are wearing a bridal gown to my wedding," I said, my voice trembling. "Take it off." "Don't be a bridezilla, Chloe," Vanessa scoffed, crossing her arms. "It's just a dress. Plus, Tyler is bringing some high-profile clients from his firm to the reception. I need to look my best. I can't be seen in cheap polyester. God, why do you always have to make everything about you?" My mother rushed into the room just then, freezing when she saw Vanessa. But instead of reprimanding her, Brenda sighed. "Oh, Vanessa, you do look stunning. Chloe, honey, let it go. You don't want to cause a scene on your special day, do you? You know how fragile your sister's self-esteem has been since her business hit a snag." I stared at the two of them. My mother, making excuses. My sister, smirking triumphantly in a stolen spotlight. For 24 years, I would have backed down. I would have swallowed the lump in my throat, walked down the aisle, and let Vanessa ruin the one day that was supposed to be mine. But I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I looked at the vintage sapphire on my finger. I wasn't the pathetic little sister anymore. I was about to be Chloe Sterling. "You're right," I said, my voice dropping to a dead, icy calm. I turned to face my sister, a genuine, terrifying smile spreading across. "In fact, make sure you walk down the aisle as slowly as possible. I want everyone to see you." Vanessa frowned, clearly unsettled by my reaction. She had wanted me to cry. She had wanted a screaming match. "Fine," she snapped. "I will." "Good," I whispered. The coordinator knocked on the door. 10 minutes, ladies. The groom's family has arrived." I nodded, adjusting my veil. Vanessa brushed past me, her massive train knocking over a chair in the process. She marched out toward the ceremony space, ready to steal the show. She didn't know that on the groom's side of the aisle sat 3 state senators, 2 tech billionaires, the CEO of the largest bank in the state, and a sea of high society elites who were all very close friends with Arthur and Eleanor Sterling. And she didn't know that my pathetic, maintenance man groom was standing at the altar wearing a custom, imported Italian tuxedo that cost more than her boyfriend's Maserati. I took a deep breath, took my father's arm, and prepared to watch my sister walk right into a trap entirely of her own making. The string quartet we had hired, a group of incredibly talented students from the local conservatory, began to play a delicate arrangement of a classical piece. The heavy, sliding wooden doors of the barn were pulled open. As the maid of honor, Vanessa was the last to walk down the aisle before me. Through the crack in the bridal suite door, I watched her make her grand entrance. She didn't just walk, she paraded. She paused at the threshold, giving the room a practiced, pageant queen smile, waiting for the collective gasp of awe, the whispers of admiration, the absolute show-stopping reaction she believed her crystal-encrusted, ivory ball gown demanded. Instead, a profound, suffocating silence fell over the right side of the aisle. My family's side, the left side, offered a few polite, albeit confused, murmurs. A couple of my mother's friends exchanged bewildered glances, clearly wondering why my sister was dressed like a runaway bride. But the right side, the groom's side, was a masterclass in high society restraint. These were people who summered in the Hamptons and attended galas at the Met. They understood wealth, and more importantly, they understood etiquette. To them, Vanessa didn't look glamorous. She looked incredibly, embarrassingly tacky. She looked like a desperate woman screaming for attention in a room full of people who didn't need to raise their voices to be heard. Eleanor Sterling, sitting in the front row in a flawless, custom-tailored navy suit, didn't even blink. She merely raised her chin a fraction of an inch, her eyes raking over Vanessa's plunging neckline and massive, ridiculous train. It was the kind of withering, aristocratic look that could freeze a lake. Beside her, Arthur Sterling politely checked his watch. Vanessa's smile began to falter as she made her slow trek toward the altar. She had expected to be the most expensive-looking thing in the room. But as she passed the pews, she began to notice the subtle details on the groom's side. The flash of a genuine Patek Philippe watch on her wrist, the unmistakable cut of a bespoke Savile Row suit, the quiet, effortless elegance of women wearing understated, six-figure heirloom jewelry. And then there was Tyler. Vanessa's flashy cryptocurrency broker boyfriend had snagged a seat in the second row on our side. As Vanessa passed him, she winked, expecting a thumbs up. Instead, Tyler looked like he was going to be physically sick. His face was entirely devoid of color, sweating profusely in his shiny, off-the-rack designer suit. I found out later exactly why. Tyler had just spent the last 10 minutes staring at the groom's side, realizing that the man sitting 2 rows behind Eleanor Sterling was none other than Harrison Caldwell, the ruthless CEO of the largest venture capital firm on the East Coast, and the man Tyler's brokerage had been desperately, unsuccessfully trying to secure a meeting with for 8 months. Sitting next to Harrison was a state senator. Sitting behind him was the owner of a major sports franchise. Tyler wasn't looking at a group of working-class relatives. He was looking at a room full of apex predators, and his girlfriend was currently insulting them by making a mockery of their host's wedding. When it was my turn, the doors closed and reopened. My father took my arm. He was tense, muttering under his breath about how much Vanessa's dress must have cost. I tuned him out. I stepped into the aisle, wearing my simple, elegant A-line silk gown. I had no sequins, no cathedral train, no tiara. But the moment I appeared, the energy in the room shifted entirely. Leo was standing at the altar. I had never seen him in a tuxedo before. He had traded his faded flannel for a masterfully tailored midnight blue Brioni tuxedo that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. His hair was neatly styled, and the grease smudges were gone, replaced by a sharp, breathtaking handsomeness that made my heart hammer in my chest. When he looked at me, his eyes filled with tears. He didn't glance at Vanessa, who was pouting off to the side, aggressively fluffing her tulle skirt to take up more space. He only saw me. As my father gave me away, slipping my hand into Leo's, Leo leaned down and whispered, "You look like a queen, Chloe. And you look like a billionaire," I whispered back, a secret smile playing on my lips. He chuckled, a low, warm sound. "Let's get married." The ceremony was beautiful, intimate, and entirely about us. We exchanged our own vows, promising to build a life together, to protect each other, and to always find joy in the quiet moments. There was not a dry eye on the groom's side. Even the ruthless venture capitalist, Harrison Caldwell, was dabbing his eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. When the officiant pronounced us husband and wife, Leo pulled me into a kiss that made the entire room erupt into cheers. For a fleeting, wonderful moment, I completely forgot about my sister, my parents, and the bomb that was about to go off at the reception. The cocktail hour was held on the paved patio outside the barn, strung with warm fairy lights. This was where the friction between the two sides of the aisle became palpable. My parents, determined to assert their perceived superiority, immediately began trying to network with Leo's guests, assuming they were middle management types who might want to invest in Vanessa's failing skincare line. I watched from the sweetheart table as my mother, Brenda, cornered a lovely older woman in a beige dress. It's such a quaint little venue, isn't it? My mother laughed loudly, swirling a cheap signature cocktail. We tried to offer Chloe our country club, but you know how young people are today. So stubborn. They insist on paying for things themselves, even if it means, well, compromising. The older woman, who happened to be Margaret DuPont, an heiress whose family practically owned the neighboring state, smiled a dangerously polite smile. "I find it utterly charming," Margaret replied smoothly. "Authenticity is so rare these days. It's a breath of fresh air compared to people who dress up in borrowed finery to pretend they are something they are not." She offered a pointed glance across the patio toward Vanessa. My mother, missing the insult entirely, beamed. "Exactly. Now, have you heard of botanical face serums?" Meanwhile, Vanessa was throwing a fit. Nobody had complimented her dress. In fact, people were actively avoiding her, stepping out of the way of her massive train as if it were contaminated. She stomped over to Tyler, grabbing his arm. "Tyler, do something," she hissed, loud enough for me to hear as I passed by with Leo. "This DJ is terrible, and the bartender won't even make me a proper martini. Tell him who you are." Tyler violently yanked his arm out of her grip. "Vanessa, shut up," he whispered frantically, his eyes darting around the patio like a cornered animal. "Just shut up. Do you have any idea who is at this wedding?" Vanessa scoffed, crossing her arms over her crystal bodice. "Yeah, a bunch of plumbers and electricians. Why are you acting so weird?" The man standing over by the heat lamp is Harrison Caldwell. Tyler ground out, his voice shaking. "The woman he's talking to is the chief financial officer of Chase Manhattan. And that guy laughing with Leo? That's David Thorne. No, wait, that's David Sterling, the tech mogul. Vanessa, these people aren't working class. They own the world." Vanessa stared at him, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Sterling? Like Leo's last name?" "Tyler, don't be an idiot. It's a common name. Leo fixes toilets." Before Tyler could explain further, the wedding coordinator announced that it was time to move inside for dinner and speeches. Dinner was a tense affair. The caterers served a beautiful, rustic farm-to-table meal, but my family barely ate, too busy whispering and glaring at the groom's side. When the plates were cleared, the clinking of glasses signaled the start of the toasts. Vanessa, practically vibrating with the need to reclaim the spotlight, was up first. She marched to the center of the dance floor, dragging her cathedral train behind her, and snatched the microphone from the stand. She gave a wide, entirely fake smile to the room. "Hi, everyone. I'm Vanessa, Chloe's older, and, let's be honest, much more exhausted sister," she began, pausing for a laugh that never came. The room was dead silent. Undeterred, she pressed on. "When Chloe first told me she was marrying Leo, I was surprised. Chloe has always been a simple girl, content with the bare minimum. And Leo, well, Leo is definitely a hard worker. I mean, it takes a lot of grit to scrub grout and unclog drains for a living." My father let out a booming laugh. My mother clapped her hands. A collective, icy chill descended upon the groom's side of the room. "But love is blind, right?" Vanessa continued, her voice dripping with venom, masquerading as affection. "And I think it's sweet that they found each other. They've built this little life, putting on this cute, budget-friendly little party in a barn. It really shows that you don't need money to be happy. You just need to lower your expectations. So, to my little sister, and her handyman, may your love be as sturdy as the drywall Leo installs." She raised her glass. Once again, only my parents and a few oblivious relatives clapped. The Sterling side stared at her with unblinking, horrifying stillness. Vanessa frowned, realizing she was bombing, and thrust the microphone back into the stand before storming back to her seat, her face flushed red with anger. I squeezed Leo's hand under the table. He leaned over and kissed my cheek. "Ready?" he whispered. "Do it," I replied. Leo's father, Arthur Sterling, stood up. He didn't rush to the microphone. He walked with the slow, measured pace of a man who was used to commanding boardrooms and entire industries. He adjusted his suit jacket, took the microphone, and looked out over the crowd. His eyes locked onto my parents' table. "Good evening," Arthur said, his voice deep, resonant, and projecting effortless authority. For those of you who do not know me, I am Arthur Sterling, Leo's father. He paused, letting the name hang in the air. At my parents' table, Tyler actually put his head in his hands. We are gathered here today to celebrate love, yes, but also authenticity, Arthur continued, his gaze drifting over to Vanessa, who was aggressively adjusting a crystal on her bodice. My son, Leonardo, is an exceptional man. When he came to me 5 years ago and told me he wanted to step away from the family business, I was hesitant. I didn't understand why the sole heir to Sterling Holdings, a company my grandfather built from the ground up into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, would want to manage dilapidated apartment complexes in the suburbs. A sharp, audible gasp ripped through my family's side of the room. My mother's wine glass slipped from her hand, shattering against her plate. My father sat bolt upright, his jaw literally dropping. Vanessa froze, the color draining from her face so fast she looked like a ghost draped in eggshell white. But Leo told me he wanted to know the value of $1, Arthur said, his voice swelling with pride as he looked at his son. He wanted to know that people loved him for who he was, not for what his last name could buy them. He wanted to find a partner who possessed genuine grace, loyalty, and a heart of gold. And looking at my beautiful new daughter-in-law, Chloe, I can confidently say he succeeded. The groom's side erupted into thunderous applause. Arthur held up a hand, silencing the room once more. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope, sealed with the Sterling family crest in gold wax. "Leo, Chloe," Arthur said, his eyes crinkling with a warm smile. "Eleanor and I wanted to give you a wedding gift that reflects the foundation you've built. Leo, your time playing undercover boss is over. Effective Monday, you are officially taking over as the Vice President of Acquisitions for Sterling Holdings." He walked over to our sweetheart table and placed the envelope in front of us. "And inside this envelope," Arthur added, turning his head just slightly so his voice carried directly to Vanessa's table, "is the deed to your new home. A fully staffed 10-acre estate in the Oakwood Hills. It's not quite a barn, but I think you'll manage to make it work. Welcome to the family, Chloe." The room exploded. The applause was deafening, a standing ovation from billionaires, senators, and CEOs. But I didn't look at them. I looked straight at my sister. Vanessa was staring at the envelope on my table, her eyes wide, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The realization was hitting her like a freight train. The handyman she had relentlessly mocked, the man whose face she had shoved into the dirt at every opportunity, was a billionaire heir. And the pathetic little sister she had tried to upstage in a tacky, crystal-encrusted gown was now one of the wealthiest women in the state. She looked down at her massive, ostentatious dress, and for the first time in her life, she looked exactly how she was: cheap. The silence that blanketed the barn in the immediate aftermath of Arthur's speech was absolute. For the first time in 26 years, I watched my family completely and utterly paralyzed by the consequences of their own arrogance. My mother, Brenda, was the first to attempt a recovery. Shaking off the shock, a terrifying plastic smile stretched across her face. She practically shoved her chair back, ignoring the shattered wine glass at her feet, and made a beeline for Eleanor Sterling. "Eleanor, darling," my mother practically sang, her voice pitched an octave too high. I had no idea. Why didn't anyone tell us? We always knew Leo was a remarkably bright young man. Jason and I were just saying yesterday how much potential he had." Eleanor turned slowly, her expression unreadable. She looked at my mother with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a particularly unappealing insect. "Brenda," Eleanor said, her voice smooth and chillingly polite, "you spent the entire rehearsal dinner implying my son was a charity case, and you allowed your eldest daughter to turn my daughter-in-law's wedding into a costume party. Do not insult my intelligence by pretending you respect us now." My mother's plastic smile fractured. She opened her mouth to argue, but Eleanor had already turned her back, dismissing her entirely. Across the room, an even more dramatic scene was unfolding at Vanessa's table. Tyler had stood up, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He wasn't looking at the Sterlings. He was glaring down at Vanessa. "Tyler, sit down," Vanessa hissed, desperately grabbing at his sleeve. "Everyone is staring at us. Just talk to Harrison Caldwell. Tell him you're with me. Tell him I'm Chloe's sister." Tyler ripped his arm away so violently that he nearly knocked over a centerpiece. "Are you out of your mind?" he seethed, his voice carrying over the quiet hum of the room. "You just publicly humiliated the Sterling family. You stood in front of a room full of venture capitalists, real estate tycoons, and politicians, and you called the heir to a multi-billion-dollar empire a plumber. You think Harrison Caldwell is going to give me the time of day after I walked in here on your arm?" "But I'm her sister," Vanessa pleaded, her voice cracking as panic finally set in. The heavy crystal bodice of her dress suddenly looked less like a crown and more like a weighted anchor. "You're a liability," Tyler spat. "We're done, Vanessa. Don't call me, don't text me, and do not ever come near my firm." Without another word, Tyler turned on his heel and marched out of the barn, leaving Vanessa sitting alone at a table that was rapidly becoming an island. I watched her process the abandonment. For a fleeting second, I almost felt a pang of pity. But then I remembered the 24 years of stolen thunder, the sabotaged milestones, and the malicious toast she had given just 10 minutes prior. The pity vanished, replaced by a profound, settling peace. Desperate to salvage the evening, Vanessa gathered the massive, cumbersome skirts of her ivory ball gown and began the long walk toward our sweetheart table. With every step, the crystals seemed to catch the light less, looking dull and entirely out of place. She stopped in front of Leo and me. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her makeup slightly smudged. "Chloe," she started, her voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of anger and desperation. "Why didn't you tell me? If you had just told me who he was, I wouldn't have worn this. We could have planned a real wedding, a 5-star hotel, a celebrity planner. We could have done this right." I looked up at her, my hands folded calmly in my lap over the heavy, wax-sealed envelope. "This is a real wedding, Vanessa," I said softly. "It just isn't yours." "You lied to us," she practically shrieked, slamming a hand down on our table. "You made us look like fools." Leo finally spoke up, his voice dangerously low. He didn't yell, he didn't have to. The quiet authority he had inherited from his father radiated from him. "Nobody made you look like a fool, Vanessa," Leo said, his eyes locking onto hers. "You did that entirely on your own. You showed everyone exactly who you are. The only difference is that now, you care about the audience." He gestured toward the door. "Now, I suggest you take your dress and leave. You're upsetting my wife." Vanessa stared at him, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for a comeback, but there was nothing left to say. She looked around the room. The billionaires, the senators, the socialites, they were all watching her, their expressions ranging from mild amusement to outright disgust. Even our own parents had retreated to a corner, too embarrassed to come to her defense. She was completely alone. With a choked sob, Vanessa turned around. She didn't parade this time. She practically ran, the heavy cathedral train dragging through a spilled puddle of red wine on the floor, as she fled the reception. The heavy barn doors closed behind her, and the string quartet seamlessly transitioned into a lively, upbeat jazz number. The tension in the room snapped, dissolving into warm laughter and the clinking of glasses. The rest of the night was pure magic. Leo and I danced under the fairy lights, surrounded by people who loved us for who we were, not for what we could do for them. My parents stayed in their corner, quietly eating their cake, entirely ignored by the high society they had so desperately wanted to impress. When it was time for our send-off, we didn't leave in Leo's old Honda Civic. A sleek, black vintage Rolls-Royce pulled up to the front of the barn, courtesy of Arthur. As Leo helped me into the back seat, I looked out the window. My mother was standing on the patio looking absolutely miserable, while my father stared at the car with naked greed. I didn't wave. I simply rolled up the window, leaned my head against my husband's shoulder, and drove away into a life that was finally, entirely mine. It has been 3 years since that unforgettable day. Leo and I are thriving in our Oakwood Hills estate, currently expecting our first beautiful child. Vanessa's skincare business inevitably went bankrupt, and my parents are still waiting for an invitation to our home that will absolutely never arrive. In the end, my sister tried so hard to bury me in her shadow, but she only dug her own social grave.